Hi, I'm Bob Clements, and I'm excited to have you join me today. We're going to be working on understanding your parts and service metrics. This is a part of some webinars that Sarah and I are doing that are pre-GIE+EXPO workshops, so that as you bring your service managers or parts managers in this year and you let Sarah and I work with them on some more advanced things, this will give everybody a good base of knowledge or understanding to start with. Understanding your parts and service metrics is an important part of the dealership because everything about a dealership is numbers. Numbers tell us the complete story, and if we know what numbers we're looking at and we know what a good number is, regardless of where we are, we can take where we're at, knowing what a good number is, and we can start working on building our processes and our pricing strategies to get us to that good number. The most important thing is understanding, again, that everything has a number to it, as I said, and what we're trying to do is kind of figure out what is our baseline. Where are we currently at in our service department and our parts department on some specific key performance indicators, and then how do we then take those numbers and how do we move them into a better direction? So the key really is in the beginning, let's figure out where you are. Where's your profit margin at in the parts, what your inventory turns on, your fill rate out of stocking inventory. Let's look and see where we're at for our recovery rate for our shop, for our tech efficiency, for our average completion time. Let's get a sense of those where we're at now. And then from there, I want to show you how you can use those numbers to move yourself in a new direction. We're going to start off in shops because you guys know me well enough to know that service and parts are my world, and service is really kind of the backbone and parts are the blood that flow through the body. So I always like to start everything off in the service department and understanding that really what we're looking at is selling time. I think one of the mistakes that sometimes people make in service departments is they really don't understand what the product is. And the product in a service department is time. We buy it by the hour, we track it by the tenth, and we sell it by the half hour or by the hour. So we pay a technician to be there maybe 8 hours a day. We want to track those 8 hours every 6 minutes, so we track by the tenth, and then we bill that time out either by the half hour or hour increments, depending upon the type of equipment you're working on. But what we're looking for, one of the numbers we're looking for, is how effectively are we selling the time that you're buying. So selling is a part of it. We do that by using a tracking method, or one of our key numbers is what we call our recovery rate. So the recovery rate looks at how well your service manager or you as an owner are selling the time that you're actually buying. So if we have a technician there 8 hours, I want to know what happened to those 8 hours. So if we had a technician there 8 hours and they billed out 7 hours in my example here on my slide, then you would be recovering 87.5% of their time. I simply take the billed hours, divide that by the paid hours they were there, and that gives me my recovery rate. So recovery is a measurement of how well we are selling the time every day we're buying. So in that example, we have 1 hour a day we're not selling anybody. 1 hour doesn't seem like much until you multiply that by, let's say your labor rate's $80 an hour times 5 days a week. So that's $400 a week we didn't bill anybody for, and especially if you have plenty of work in your shop, that's a lot of money. We paid for the time, we just didn't sell it. If you look at that times 4 weeks, that's $1,600 a month. And let's say you can only keep your shop busy 10 months out of the year. That's $16,000 a year that we lost because we lost a technician billing out 7 hours instead of a full 8 hours, or even more if you're doing flat rating and things like that. So recovery rate's an important measurement. It lets me know also, when do we need to add technicians? So if you take all your recovery times with your technicians, and if we're recovering at 95% or higher, then we know we need another technician. If you're recovering in the 70s, or in many cases, the dealers we work with in the beginning are recovering at 60%, they end up having too many technicians once the process gets going, and they get all their efficiencies and things in the process. So recovery rate is an important measurement. And again, it's just basically looking at how many billed hours did a technician produce versus how many paid hours were they paid to be there. Tech efficiency is another number that we're looking at. It's a little different measurement. It's not the same as recovery. I know some people have told me that whether they're the same thing, they're not. Tech efficiency, it looks at how efficient a technician is on an individual work order that's been assigned to them. So the recovery rate looks at how many hours I paid you to be there versus how many hours did you bill out. Tech efficiency is how many hours do we have available to bill on a work order, and how'd you do relative to that. So again, if I've got work orders that I'm doing there and I ended up doing, in my example, 7 billed hours in 6 hours of time, I would be 116% efficient. That's a pretty good number if you're working in big ag. It's a decent number if you're working in outdoor power. So it's billed hours divided by actual time clocked on a work order. So if I clocked on a work order and I did multiple workout orders throughout the day, and I ended up with 7 billed hours that day, and I only spent 6 hours actually on work orders, then I would have a tech efficiency of 116%. Now think about that, Lo. So there's still, if I was there 8 hours, I turned a wrench for 6 hours and I billed out 7, that's going to make our recovery rate very low for that technician. So if I were your owner or I were a manager, I'd be asking what happened to those 6 hours that you were turning a wrench, what happened to the other 2 hours that we didn't get collected for? And if we look at that happening on a regular basis, now we're looking at about $32,000 to $35,000 a year at $80 an hour that we're losing. So tech efficiency is the measurement of how many hours are you on work orders versus how many hours did you end up billing out. And I had a person again the other day said, well, how can you bill out more time than you're actually on it? Because again, if you haven't been through it yet, I have another one of these webcasts on flat rating and time and material jobs, really how to do and build jobs out correctly. So if you haven't seen that yet, you're going to want to go through that also as a part of it. Then the other thing that we want to look at is ultimately our customers are getting to a point where they want to schedule things into our shop. And the only way you can do that is to calculate what your average completion time is. And the average completion time is how long does it take on the average, if I'm your technician, every time I'm on a work order as an average, how long does it take me to take a work order from open to close to where I'm done with it or completed in some of you guys' software, closed or completed to where I'm now done with it. That lets me then work to start scheduling work into my shop once I know that number. So we look at 2 things in our shops, completion time by technician, and then we look at completion time for the total shop. So completion time by technicians, we take the actual time on work orders divided by the number of completed work orders. So I had 32 wrench hours on work orders, and that represented 18 work orders. So I had 32 hours on 18 work orders, then my average time to complete a work order would be 1.78 hours. So not quite 2 hours. So now if you're looking and you're saying a customer comes in and says, hey, I need you to fix my mower, my tractor, my baler, I don't know, pick a product, whatever it is that you happen to be working on. And you know that I'm going to be the guy doing it, okay, and you see, and you say, gosh, you know, Bob's got 10 open work orders, okay, and the customer says, when can I bring it in? Well, you know, if Bob's got 10 open work orders, on an average, his time to complete a work order is 1.78 hours, so that would be about 12 hours of time. You know, so you can have them bringing in, you know, 15 to 16 hours past that, and we know we can actually stage that work in. The other one we want to look at is average completion time for the shop as a total, because that again gives us a sense of, as we looked at our total shop and we multiplied our total shop, how far we are behind by our average completion time for the shop, I could tell you probably within 2 hours how far we are behind at any given point in our service department. So again, if we looked at it in the same context, we have 160 hours of wrench time divided into 125 work orders that have now went from open to close, and you'll see that that calculation is 1.28 hours. So, you know, if I've got 50 pieces of equipment in my shop and they're not specifically assigned to a person, I could literally take, let's say we'd roll that up to 1.5 hours on an average, and I got 50 pieces there. I got approximately 30 hours of work in my shop, where it may seem like I got 50 pieces out there. How am I ever going to get caught up? You literally are maybe 4 days behind, 5 maybe at the most, on your work in your shop. So that average completion time is an important number to know. And because at some point, as you continue to evolve in this business, in the service business, people are going to want to go to your website and schedule services in. And by using this and tracking this specific number, we'll be able to schedule people into our shops. Then the other piece that we want to look at is what our labor to parts ratio is. And this is where we look at, on the average, for every dollar that we bill on labor, what's our average percentage of parts that we're putting on. I want you to understand that the higher that ratio is, so if I've got for every dollar's worth of labor, I'm putting on 80 cents worth of part, the more parts I put on, the less comebacks I tend to have. I find in shops when that number is low, maybe $1 to 40 cents a part or $1 to 30 cents a parts, I get a lot more comebacks because we're trying to fix things rather than just replace things. I see this all the time on carburetors, on small engines, where somebody's, you know, got a carburetor that they're going to rebuild, and it's a carburetor that you can replace for $60, and they're rebuilding it, and then they put it on and it doesn't work, or the customer takes it and it comes back and it doesn't work, and that's where we get our comebacks from. So it's trying to find a balance between, you know, I don't want to put things on that aren't necessary. That's not what I'm talking about here, but if we could buy a new part and put on instead of rebuilding an old part, and it's somewhere cost effective relative to the time it takes to rebuild something and put it back on versus just unbolting something and put it back on, then we're always better to put new parts on, because there's a high probability it just simply won't come back. So that's what we want to take a look at there, and that's really a pretty simple calculation. It's just total parts sold to service divided by total labor sales. And you should be in your business management software, by the way, separating parts sold to the shop as a category versus counterparts or online parts. Separate those two out as just a normal part of what you're doing in your software, and it's an easy calculation to do. As we look at parts, we look at measuring transactions. That's ultimately what we're looking at in the parts department. So like we sell time in a shop, we have transactions that we keep track of, and each transaction has some number associated with this. The first thing we want to know is what's our average transaction value for our parts department. So I want to know, on the average, every time we make a sale, whether it's to the shop or whether it's a counter sale or maybe an online sale, what's the average value of that transaction? And it's a relatively simple number to come up with. You just took your total parts sales over some period of time, and you divided that by the number of transactions that represented, whether it's to the parts department on work orders or online sales or counter customers. Just divide those two together, and it's going to give you your average transaction value. My example on our slide is we did $32,000 worth of parts sales, and that represented 800 transactions. Our average transaction value would be $40. You say, well, Bob, who cares? Well, I care, because what I want to do is, if we're trying to grow our parts department, say by 10%, as I do this evaluation every week or maybe every 2 weeks in my parts department, I should see that average transaction value going from, say, maybe $40 to 41 or 42 or 43. It lets me know my parts people are upselling and cross-selling. If it's staying the same or it's going down, then I know that there's a problem there. So that average transaction value is an important number to be looking at. Then we also want to look at the average transaction per salesperson. And again, what I want to see is, on the average, as I looked at my salespeople, what are the average number of transactions that they need to be doing? Because if I'm getting a lot of pushback from my parts department saying, we've got to have another person, we got to have another person, we got to have another person, I can look at my average transaction per parts person. Then I can pull up each person's transactions that they did in the software, and I might have somebody that's averaging 500 with somebody else averaging 300. And my problem is, I don't need another parts person. I need to train the parts person who's only doing 300 transactions, because they're probably taking too long, having too long of conversations with the customers. They don't know how to move a customer to get the part and then move on out the door. So many times, I don't have a bad parts person. I just have a parts person that's a little chatty that I need to work with to teach them how to do a better job of moving people through, when we're busy, the parts counter, without offending that person and making them feel like they're not important there. So that's another important thing to look at, because I can look at two parts people, then I see what the average is. If I got one person that's way over that average and one person that's under that average, I don't need another parts person. I need to do some training on a parts person that I have, because if I got one guy doing 500 and another guy doing 300, I know 500 is possible if it's done correctly. And so again, I don't need to throw another body at it. I've got some training issues that I need to deal with there. Then the average transaction time is another thing we're looking at, and the average transaction time is literally, on the average, how long does it take us to move a customer from the parts counter back out the door with either a part or us ordering a part. So it's really a measurement of time. And this goes back again to kind of looking at each one of your parts people. If somebody's got a shorter transaction time than the other person, then it tells me I need to do some training. The transaction times are about the same, right? My target is to say, how do I get that faster? How do I move people faster from the parts counter back out the door? And you do that, the easiest way to do it is to make sure that you got your fastest moving parts as close as you can get them to your parts counter. The one thing that kills your transaction times are steps. And the longer you have to go to get someplace, the more steps you have to take, it just sucks up more time. So part of your goal, again, as a parts manager, is to always be evaluating where your parts are set at. Do I have my 50 fastest moving parts as close as I can physically get them to my parts counter, so my people aren't walking 800 feet to go get a belt? Literally, I've got my fastest moving belts on the pegged wall behind my parts counter, and I reach back and get the belt. Now you go, well, Bob, that's going to throw my belts out of sequence. You have software where you can keep track of parts by location. That wall at the shop, at the parts counter wall, would be location wall W1, wall location number 1, and you're going to have lines on it. So that just goes back to utilizing your software. What's a good time? It really depends upon the industry you're in. If you're in outdoor power, we expect a good time to be around 7 minutes. you're working with compact utility tractors, that's probably closer to 12 minutes. And if you're working in big ag, you're probably going to be looking at 15 minutes on the average to get a person in and out. But again, it doesn't really matter what a good time is. You just need to figure out what your time is, and then from there, work on finding ways to improve that and making that time better. One of the other things that we want to look at, a number in the parts department, is our fill rate out of stocking inventory. I hear more and more people talk about, well, people just go online and order things. Well, they do that because you don't have what they need in stock. Now, you can't keep everything in stock, but you should be keeping wear parts and service parts in stock on everything that you sell. So if a customer came in and bought a product from you, a piece of equipment from you, they should expect you to have the service parts and any wear parts in stock on that equipment. So we want to find out what our fill rate out of stocking inventory is. And the easiest way to do it, again, now most of your software will do this if you're keeping track of everything correctly. But what we're trying to do is say, how can we make sure that more and more people, when they come in, I have the part they need so they don't have to worry about going online or someplace else to get it. And it's a simple calculation. Again, we simply take the total parts sold, we subtract lost sales, special orders, emergency orders, right? And then we divide that back by the total parts sold. So my example on the slide is if I had 200 parts that I sold, then I would subtract 10 lost sales. And by the way, I'll talk about lost sales in just a second. 8 special orders and 2 emergency orders. I redivide that by the 200, and it tells me my fill rate out of stocking order would be 90%. So that means 10% of the time for products that I sell, I'm not going to have the part that somebody needs. That's a pretty good number. It needs to be low in that high 80s, low 90 range is what you're targeting for to be there. If you're not keeping track of lost sales, you can't do this calculation. I know a lot of parts people say, well, we don't keep track of lost sales. I'm going to challenge you on not keeping track of lost sales, because if you're a parts manager, you're putting parts in your inventory based upon demands. Most of my parts managers, if they have a part where they've had 3 unique demands over a period of 90 to 120 days, they will put that part in, maybe 1 or 2 of them in as a stocking part. Okay? If you're not keeping track of lost sales, you're losing a demand, and you may end up not having the parts people need because you simply are not keeping track of lost sales. And all of a sudden, you are the one, not the customer, that's forcing them to go online and buy. So that fill rate out of stocking inventory is an important number to be looking at. Gross profit margin is another one. And again, where does it need to be at? All depends upon your industry. But again, our goal is to make money. And people talk about MSRP and all the things like this. And Sarah and I are going to be talking about some of those things at the workshop. What does MSRP mean and what's it based around? Because a lot of you get the wrong perception of that everything has to be sold at MSRP. MSRP is a made-up number by a manufacturer. It really has nothing to do with the reality of what you need to charge for a part. You might be over MSRP. You could be under MSRP. It's literally all based upon the number of turns that you're making on a part, on what you have to do with the pricing on it. But gross profit margin is a basic measurement that we're doing. And again, it's simply I take my parts, cost of goods sold, divided by my parts sales, and that gives me my gross profit margin. And you'll see on the screen the calculation is there for doing that. Now, most of your software is giving this to you on a daily, weekly, or at least a monthly basis. I can't tell you exactly where you need to be. I would tell you again that in the outdoor power world, most of the dealers we work with are in the 48 to 53% average gross profit margin on OEM parts. In the compact utility tractor, that rural lifestyle customer, they're running 42 to 45. And as we get into big ag or construction, we're running 35 to 38. So in those worlds is where you ought to be looking at getting that there. And then we'll be talking at the workshop about some different pricing strategies with velocity pricing and tiered pricing to help you move those numbers up without having an impact on the customer. And then the other one you want to look at is your parts inventory turns. Now, the old rule of thumb is we wanted to try to turn parts 4 to 5 times. Well, that was back before we had online parts sales. You're going to find that you're going to have less turns on your inventory to have your fill rate right so that you get a good fill rate out of stocking inventory. So I'm going to challenge you a little bit on that. There are going to be some parts that you're going to be able to turn more than maybe 4 times. But I tell people today, because of the internet and because of online sales, we've got to reevaluate our turns on our inventory. But it's a simple measurement again. We take our cost of goods sold for the year, and we divide it by our inventory on hand, and that gives me my turns for the year. One of the other measurements I like to do is our inventory days on hand, which again gives me a little finer tune. So instead of saying I got 3 turns a year, if I took my 365 days in a year, divided it by my inventory turn, which in my example was 3, it would tell me that I have enough parts on hand to last 121.6 days. So I like to do the inventory days on hand a little bit more myself personally than the parts inventory turns, because I think it gives me a little tighter number on what we're looking for. So we've talked about some basic metrics in service and parts here in a relatively quick amount of time. That's what we wanted to do. We wanted to kind of get you primed and ready. So when you come to the GIE+EXPO this fall on October 16th, 17th, and 18th at the Kentucky Exposition Center, you're ready to come into Sarah and I's classes pumped, ready, motivated to take you to another level. We are looking forward to seeing you as an owner, and we're looking forward to see and having you bring your sales manager and your parts manager down to let Sarah and I take them to the next level.